Hi everyone, welcome back to Mental Wealth Reads. We're going to get back into trauma and recovery. It's been a little while actually since I've cracked this book open, so it is a little exciting for me to get back into it, and I believe we're in the middle of a chapter where things start being explained, which is awesome. But we're going to start today with looks like part 2 of chapter 2. I guess that's what we're doing right now. And it looks like we'll be able to finish this in one little video. This is gonna be a shorter one, which is fine, totally fine. These chapters are longer than the average book that I've been reading, so we're gonna go right back into this, starting with the section of part 2 or chapter 2 called constriction. When a person is completely powerless and any form of resistance is futile, she may go into a state of surrender. The system of self-defense shuts down entirely. The helpless person escapes from her situation not by action in the real world, but rather by altering her state of consciousness. Analogous states are observed in animals who sometimes freeze when they are attacked. These are the responses of captured prey to predator or of a defeated contestant in battle. A rape survivor describes her experience of this state of surrender. Did you ever see a rabbit stuck in the glare of your headlights when you were going down a road at night? Transfixed, like it knew it was going to get it. That's what happened. In the words of another rape survivor, I couldn't scream, I couldn't move. I was paralyzed, like a rag doll. These alterations of consciousness are at the heart of constriction or numbing, the third cardinal symptom of post-traumatic stress disorder. Sometimes situations of inescapable danger may evoke not only terror and rage, but also, paradoxically, a state of detached calm, in which terror, rage, and pain dissolve. Events continue to register in awareness, but it is as though these events have been disconnected from their ordinary meanings. Perceptions may be numbed or distorted with partial anesthesia or the loss of particular sensations. Time sense may be altered, often with the sense of slow motion, and the experience may lose its quality of ordinary reality. The person may feel as though the event is not happening to her, as though she is observing from outside her body, or as though the whole experience is a bad dream from which she will shortly awaken. These perceptual changes combine with a feeling of indifference, emotional attachment, and profound passivity in which the person relinquishes all initiative and struggle. This altered state of consciousness might be regarded as one of nature's small mercies, a protection against unbearable pain. A rape survivor describes this detached state. I left my body at that point. I was over next to the bed, watching this happen. I dissociated from the helpless. I was standing next to me, and there was just a shell on the bed. There was just a feeling of flatness. I was just there. When I repicture the room, I don't picture it from the bed. I picture it from the side of the bed. That's where I was watching from. A combat veteran from the Second World War reports a similar experience. Like most of the Fourth, I was numb, in a state of virtual disassociation. There is a condition which we call the 2,000-year stare. This was the anesthetized look, the wide, hollow eyes of a man who no longer cares. I wasn't to that state yet, but the numbness was total. I felt almost as if I hadn't actually been in a battle. These detached states of consciousness are similar to hypnotic trance states. They share the same feelings of surrender, of voluntary action, suspension of initiative, and critical judgment. Subjective detachment or calm, enhanced perception of imagery, altered sensation, including numbness and analgesia, and distortion of reality, including depersonalization, derealization, and a change in the sense of time. While the heightened perceptions occurring during traumatic events resemble the phenomena of hypnotic absorption, the numbing systems resemble the complementary phenomena of hypnotic dissociation. Genet thought that his hysterical patient's capacity for trance was evidence of psychopathology. More recent studies have demonstrated that although people vary in their ability to enter hypnotic states, trance is a normal property of human consciousness. Traumatic events serve as powerful activators of the capacity for trance. As the psychiatrist David Spiegel points out, it would be surprising indeed if people did not spontaneously use this capacity to reduce their perception of pain during acute trauma. But while people usually enter hypnotic states under controlled circumstances and by choice, traumatic trance states occur in an uncontrolled manner, usually without conscious choice. The biological factors underlying these altered states, both hypnotic trance and traumatic dissociation, remain an enigma. The psychologist Ernest Hilgard speculates that hypnosis may be acting in a manner parallel to morphine. The use of hypnosis as a substitute for opiates to produce analgesia has long been known. Both hypnosis and morphine produce a dissociative state in which the perception of pain and the normal emotional responses to pain are severed. Both hypnosis and opiates diminish the distress of intractable pain. Both hypnosis and opiates diminish the distress of intractable pain, without abolishing the sensation itself. The psychiatrists Robert Pittman and Vander Kolk, who have demonstrated persistent alterations in pain perception in combat veterans with post-traumatic stress disorder, suggest that trauma may produce long-lasting alterations in the regulation of endogenous opioids, which are natural substances having the same effects as opiates within the central nervous system. Traumatized people who cannot spontaneously dissociate may attempt to produce similar numbing effects by using alcohol or narcotics. Observing the behavior of soldiers in wartime, Grinker and Spiegel found that uncontrolled drinking increased proportionately to the combat group's losses. The soldiers' use of alcohol appeared to be an attempt to obliterate their growing sense of helplessness and terror. It seems clear that traumatized people run a high risk of compounding their difficulties by developing dependence on alcohol or other drugs. The psychologist Josephina Card, in a study of Vietnam-era veterans and their civilian peers, demonstrated that men who developed post-traumatic stress disorder were far more likely to have engaged in heavy consumption of narcotics and street drugs, and to have received treatment for problems with alcohol or drug abuse after their return from the war. In another study of 100 combat veterans with severe post-traumatic stress disorder, Herbert Hendon and Ann Haas noted that 85% developed serious drug and alcohol problems after their return to civilian life. Only 7% had used alcohol heavily before they went to war. The men used alcohol and narcotics to try to control their hyperarousal and intrusive symptoms: insomnia, nightmares, irritability, and rage outbursts. Their drug abuse, however, ultimately compounded their difficulties and further alienated them from others. The largest and most comprehensive investigation of all, the National Vietnam Veterans Readjustment Study, reported almost identical findings. 75% of men with the disorder developed problems with alcohol abuse or dependence. Although dissociative alterations in consciousness or even intoxication may be adaptive to the moment of total helplessness, they become maladaptive once the danger is past. Because these altered states keep the traumatic experience walled off from the ordinary consciousness, they prevent the integration necessary for healing. Unfortunately, the constrictive or dissociative states, like other symptoms of the post-traumatic syndrome, prove to be remarkably tenacious. Lifton likened psychic numbing, which he found to be universal in survivors of disaster and war, to the paralysis of the mind. Constrictive symptoms, like intrusive symptoms, were first described in the domain of memory. Genet noted that post-traumatic amnesia was due to a constriction of the field of consciousness, which kept painful memories split off from ordinary awareness. When his hysterical patients were in a hypnotic trance state, they were able to replicate the dissociated events in exquisite detail. His patient, Irene, for example, reported a dense amnesia for a 2-month time period surrounding her mother's death. In trance, she was able to reproduce all the harrowing events of those months, including the death scene, as though they were occurring in the present. Gardner also recognized that a constrictive process kept traumatic memories out of normal consciousness. allowing only a fragment of memory to emerge as an intrusive symptom. He cited the case of a Navy veteran who complained of a persistent sensation of numbness, pain, and cold from the waist down. This patient denied any traumatic experiences during the war. On persistent questioning without formal use of hypnosis, he recalled the sinking of his ship and the many hours he had spent awaiting rescue in the icy water, but he denied having any emotional reaction to the event. However, as Gardner pressed on, the patient became agitated, angry, and frightened. The similarities between the symptoms of which he complained and his being submerged in cold water from the waist down were pointed out to him. He admitted that when he closed his eyes and allowed himself to think of his present situations, he still imagined himself clinging to the raft, half submerged in the sea. He then said that while he was clinging to the raft, his sensations were extremely painful, and that he thought of nothing else during the time. He also recalled the fact that several of the men had lost consciousness and had drowned. To a large extent, the patient obviously owed his life to his concentration of the painful sensations occasioned by the cold water. Hence, the symptom represented a reproduction of the original sensations of being submerged in the water. In this case, the constrictive process resulted not in complete amnesia, but in the formation of a truncated memory, devoid of emotion and meaning. The patient did not allow himself to think about the meaning of his symptom, for to do so would have brought back all the pain, terror, and rage of narrowly escaping death and witnessing the deaths of his comrades. This voluntary suppression of thoughts related to the traumatic event is characteristic of traumatized people, as are the less conscious forms of dissociation. Constrictive symptoms of the traumatic neurosis apply not only to thought, memory, and states of consciousness, but also to the entire field of purposeful action and initiative. In an attempt to create some sense of safety and to control their pervasive fear, traumatized people restrict their lives. 2 rape survivors describe how their lives narrowed after the trauma. I was terrified to go anywhere on my own. I felt too defenseless and too afraid, and so I just stopped doing anything. I would just stay home, and I was just frightened. I cut off all my hair. I did not want to be attractive to men. I just wanted to look neutered for a while because that felt safer. The combat veteran Ken Smith describes how he rationalized the constriction of his life that occurred after combat, so that for a long time, he did not recognize how much he was ruled by fear. I worked exclusively midnight to 8 or 11 to 7. Never understood why. I was so concerned about being awake at night because I had this thing about being afraid of the night. Now I know that, then I didn't. I rationalized it because there wasn't as much supervision. I got more freedom. I didn't have to listen to the political infighting bullshit. Nobody really bothered me. I was left alone. Constrictive symptoms also interfere with anticipation and planning for the future. Grinker and Spiegel observed that soldiers in wartime responded to the losses and injuries within their group with diminished confidence in their own ability to make plans and take initiative, with increased superstitious and magical thinking, and with great reliance on lucky charms and omens. Terre, in a study of kidnapped schoolchildren, described how afterward the children came to believe that there had been omens warning them of the traumatic event. Years after the kidnapping, these children continued to look for omens to protect them and guide their behavior. Moreover, years after the event, the children retained foreshortened sense of the future. When asked what they wanted to be when they grew up, many replied that they never fantasized or made plans for the future because they expected to die young. In avoiding any situations reminiscent of the past trauma or initiative that might involve future planning and risk, traumatized people deprive themselves of those new opportunities for successful coping that might mitigate the effect of the traumatic experience. Thus, constrictive symptoms, though they may represent an attempt to defend against overwhelming emotional states, exact a high price for whatever protection they afford. They narrow and deplete the quality of life and ultimately perpetuate the effects of the traumatic event. In the aftermath of an experience of overwhelming danger, the 2 contradictory responses of intrusion and constriction establish an oscillating rhythm. This dialect of opposing psychological states is perhaps the most characteristic feature of the post-traumatic syndromes. Since neither the intrusive nor the numbing symptoms allow for integration of the traumatic event, The alternation between these two extreme states might be understood as an attempt to find a satisfactory balance between the two. But balance is precisely what the traumatized person lacks. She finds herself caught between the extremes of amnesia or of reliving the trauma, between floods of intense, overwhelming feeling and arid states of no feeling at all, between irritable, impulsive action and complete inhibition of action. The instability produced by these periodic alternations further exacerbates the traumatized person's sense of unpredictability and helplessness. The dialect of trauma is therefore potentially self-perpetuating. In the course of time, this dialect undergoes a gradual evolution. Initially, intrusive reliving of the traumatic event predominates, and the victim remains in a highly agitated state, on alert for new threats. Intrusive symptoms emerge most prominently in the first few days or weeks following the traumatic event, abate to some degree within 3 to 6 months, and then attenuate slowly over time. For example, in a large-scale community study of crime victims, rape survivors generally reported that their most severe intrusive symptoms diminished after 3 to 6 months, but they were still fearful and anxious 1 year following the rape. Another study of rape survivors also found the majority, 80%, still complaining of intrusive fears at the 1 year mark. When a different group of rape survivors were recontacted 2 to 3 years after they had first been seen in a hospital emergency room, the majority were still suffering from symptoms attributable to rape. Trauma-specific fears, sexual problems, and restriction of daily activities were the symptoms these survivors reported most commonly. The traumatic injury persists over even a longer period. For example, 4 to 6 years after their study of rape victims at a hospital emergency room, Ann Burgess and Linda Holmstrom recontacted the women. By that time, 3/4 of the women considered themselves to have recovered. In retrospect, about 1/3, or 37%, thought it had taken them less than a year to recover, and 1/3, 37%, felt it had taken more than a year. But one woman in 4, or 26%, felt that she had still not recovered. A Dutch study of people who were taken hostage also documents the long-lasting effects of a single traumatic event. All the hostages were symptomatic in the first month after being set free, and 75% were still symptomatic after 6 months to a year. The longer they had been in captivity, the more symptomatic they were, and the slower they were to recover. On long-term follow-up 6 to 9 months later, after the event, almost half the survivors, or 46%, still reported constrictive symptoms, and 1/3, or 32%, still had intrusive symptoms. While general anxiety symptoms tended to diminish over time, psychosomatic symptoms actually got worse. While specific trauma-related symptoms seem to fade over time, they can be revived, even years after the event, by reminders of the original trauma. Gardner, for example, described a combat veteran who suffered an attack of intrusive symptoms on the anniversary of a plane crash which he had survived 8 years previously. In a more recent case, nightmares of other intrusive symptoms suddenly reoccurred in a Second World War combat veteran after a delay of 30 years. As intrusive symptoms diminish, numbing or constrictive symptoms come to predominate. The traumatized person may no longer seem frightened and may resume the outward forms of her previous life. But the severing of events from their ordinary meanings and the distortion in the sense of reality persist. She may complain that she is just going through the motions of living, as if she were observing the events of daily life from a great distance. Only the repeated reliving of the moment of horror temporarily breaks through the sense of numbing and disconnection. The alienation and inner deadness of the traumatized person is captured in Virginia Woolf's classic portrait of a shell-shocked veteran. "Beautiful," his wife would murmur, nudging Septimus that he might see. But beauty was behind a pane of glass. Even taste, Rezia liked ices, chocolates, sweet things, and had no relish to him. He put down his cup on the little marble table. He looked at people outside. Happy they seemed, collecting in the middle of the street, shouting, laughing, squabbling over nothing. But he could not taste, he could not feel, in the tea shop among the tables and the chattering waiters, The appalling fear came over him. He could not feel. The constraints upon the traumatized person's inner life and outer range of activity are negative symptoms. They lack trauma, their significance lies in what is missing. For this reason, constrictive symptoms are not readily recognized, and their origins in a traumatic event are often lost. With the passage of time, as these negative symptoms become the most prominent feature of the post-traumatic disorder, the diagnosis becomes increasingly easy to overlook. Because post-traumatic symptoms are so persistent and so wide-ranging, they can be mistaken for enduring characteristics of the victim's personality. This is a costly error, for the person with unrecognized post-traumatic stress disorder is condemned to a diminished life, tormented by memory and bounded by helplessness and fear. Here again in Lessing's portrait of her father. The young bank clerk who worked such long hours for so little money, but who danced, sang, played, flirted, this naturally vigorous, sensuous being was killed in 1914, 1915, 1916. I think the best of my father died in that war, that his spirit was crippled by it. The people I've met, particularly the women who knew him young, speak of his high spirits, his energy, and his enjoyment for life. Also of his kindness, his compassion, and a word that keeps recurring, his wisdom. I do not think these people would have easily recognized the ill, irritable, abstracted, hypochondriac man I knew. Long after the event, many traumatized people feel that a part of themselves has died. The most profoundly afflicted wish that they were dead. Perhaps the most disturbing information on the long-term effects of traumatic events comes from a community study of crime victims, including 100 women who had been raped. The average time elapsed since the rape was 9 years. The study recorded only major mental health problems without paying attention to the more subtle levels of post-traumatic symptomology. Each by these crude measures, the lasting destructive effects of the trauma were apparent. Rape survivors reported more nervous breakdowns, more social thoughts, and more suicide attempts than any other group. While prior to the rape, they had been no more likely than anyone else to attempt suicide. Almost 1 in 5%, or 19.2%, made a suicide attempt following the rape. The estimate of actual suicide following severe trauma is riddled with controversy. Popular media have reported, for example, that there were more deaths of Vietnam veterans by suicide after the war than deaths in combat. These accounts appear to be highly exaggerated, but mortality studies nevertheless suggest that combat trauma may indeed increase the risk of suicide. Hendon and Haas found in their study of combat veterans with post-traumatic stress syndrome that a significant minority had made suicide attempts, 19%, or were constantly preoccupied with suicide, 15%. Most of the men who were persistently suicidal had heavy combat exposure. They suffered from unresolved guilt about their wartime experiences and from severe unremitting anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress symptoms. 3 of the men died by suicide during the course of the study. Thus, the very threat of annihilation that defined the traumatic moment may pursue the survivor long after the danger has passed. No wonder that Freud found in the traumatic neurosis signs of a demonic force at work. The terror, rage, and hatred of the traumatic moment live on in the dialect of trauma. Okay, so that's the end of chapter 2. Now, what I want to focus on this chapter, on this video specifically, are the 2 things that we talked about. So you have this idea of freezing, right? That sort of disconnecting from reality, right? And that is honestly one of the most common responses to trauma. And we've all heard it, the fight, flight, or freeze kind of idea, response that you can typically expect to have happened within a story of trauma, right? And I want to point this out because what I have just observed and learned and just discovered, over the course of being a therapist is that while it is very much more acceptable, or at least known, that the freeze option is actually very very common now. It's something that more and more people are reporting, right? There are still areas where there is some negative stigma to that, right? As if that's the weak version of that response. Like if you freeze, you're the least strong of people who have survived or experienced trauma. And I want to say out loud that that's certainly not true. All three of them are essentially your body just deciding in a split second how to respond to danger, right? And as it was mentioned too, like there's quite often and almost always a calm, right? Your body is so overloaded when the trauma is happening. Your body is just so overloaded with the emotions of trauma and the what's happening to you, right? That if you can't escape it, right, physically, you either have the choice of ignoring it with the interest of eventually being able to fight it off, right? So ignoring the emotional piece of it to be able to deal with the more physical response to it, or you're going to cut that off emotionally so that you can detach yourself from what's happening, right? So you don't feel all the panic and all the terror and all the other emotions that are involved in that. And that's totally natural, right? That's why I'm trying to say that it absolutely has nothing to do with you being weak. It has nothing to do with your brain being wrong or handling things the wrong way, right? There is no right way to deal with trauma, because trauma is not the right way to experience life, right? Trauma should not be a thing. There should not be this condition where people are subject to trauma. There's nothing fair about it, right? There's nothing fair about war. There's nothing fair about experiencing it and being a part of it. There's nothing fair about death, right? And so experiencing that, especially to a heightened degree, in a situation where you weren't expecting it, right? There's no right or wrong way to respond to that on a physical, mental, and emotional level, right? They simply don't have, courses, when you're growing up. This is how you respond to trauma, right? That's what we do with our operatives or our secret agents, right? Kind of in the movies, right? They have that training to be, to withstand torture, right? But by no means is it something that we should expect, the average person to need to know how to do, because in an idealistic world, right, which is something I think we're all trying to work for in our own ways, right, those things shouldn't happen, right? We shouldn't need to be prepared for those things. And another thing, more on a philosophical level, the human brain is not initially conditioned or not initially created to expect evil from other people, right? Expect bad things to happen to them. Now that can be something that a person learns over the course of their life, but depending on what kind of a life they had, who they were raised by, what their experiences were, you can ultimately start expecting that from people. But up to a point, right, the human existence has actually a really high tolerance for that kind of a thing, right? So that, even in the midst of trauma, even if you are going through the worst symptoms, it is because your brain still, believes to some degree that people are good, right? People are good, and this is not the norm, right? You may be dealing with the fact that, this happened to me, and that might be a section of that shock, right? And that feeling of terror almost, and just overall confusion. But still, at the end of the day, there is an expectation in the majority of humans, right, that the world will not do this to me again, right? Now, that's on a philosophical level, right? What we're saying in this chapter, though, is that expectation, both emotionally and on some levels mentally, right, and even physically to a degree, unless that trauma is processed and that person has been able to make peace with their experiences, and the fact that they happen to them, right? That can come back, right? Your body can even, they said, even delayed as much as 30 years, which I think is kind of crazy, but you can still have that experience of that later on. Your body comes up with, these, what we call flashbacks, right? And nightmares and symptoms that, generally speaking, are reminders of this trauma, right? And so, again, I want to highlight that too, because that also doesn't mean that you did something wrong, right? That also doesn't mean that in the course of trying to figure out how to deal with the symptoms of your trauma that you have just been living wrong, right? Trauma is not a punishment from God. I want to throw that out there. I don't know if I mentioned that before in these videos, but trauma is not a God saying he's displeased with you. Trauma is not God or anyone in the universe, right? Whatever you believe, right? Trauma is something that is a result of things happening, set in motion or set on this sort of chain reaction by other behaviors of us humans, right? For the most part, right? Now you can talk about like tsunamis and things like that, but that's still the world, that's still the earth, that's, not typically because there is some entity that is angry with you, right? So that's so to say nobody deserves trauma. Nobody in the, like, no matter what kind of a life you live, nobody deserves to be, to have that as an experience, right? So that being said, the second part of this was leaning more towards or talking more about that dialect, right? What they call the dialect, where you have trauma, right? You experience this trauma. And then you have the symptoms that follow later, right? And in order to separate yourself from them, it's a very common thing to find ways to separate yourself from those, right? And they talked about the numbing sense, right? You either went from these waves, I guess, these cycles of either feeling nothing at all or feeling all of them, right? All the things to a great degree, right? And so the body naturally is going to try to either fix those things or run from those things, right? Or hide them, right? Because in a way, you're reliving that trauma, right? Even if it's just one of the symptoms, right? You're not currently in the situation that created that, but your brain and your body and your mind, are all remembering it for whatever reason, right? And so ultimately, what happens is, because the average person is going to want to try and either shove those down or find something to do with them, that's on, varying degrees of level of being healthy, right? Because of that, the trauma is just going to get pushed back down, and then it'll be dormant for a little while, and then it'll come back, right? There's that sort of dialect, and then there's the other dialect that they talk about where, it's the trauma's happening, or the experiences or the symptoms are happening, right? And so you isolate yourself from people, because, and this is also super common, right? And we see this a lot in people returning from war, right? Or even just, deploying in some way, in whatever way, right? The experiences that they had were so big that, one, they don't want to share them with other people because they don't want to do the same thing to them, right? And two, they don't know what to do with them having them themselves, right? They don't know how to make sense of it. They don't know what to do with it. So they tend to keep it to themselves, which creates this, isolation of sorts, either physically or emotionally or both, right? From wives, husbands, children, even just close friends, right? And then that kind of accentuates this feeling of being alone, right? And then that just leaves you, or the person, right, with them by themselves and their own emotions, right? With nothing to help them process it. And like they said, a lot of the response seems to either be alcoholism and substance use, or suicide itself, right? Because ultimately, a human by themselves cannot figure out how to process trauma. That's just a fact, right? And there's nothing wrong with that, right? There's nothing wrong with realizing that you can't figure out what to do with the emotions or the mental health that you have on the inside, right? That's what therapists are for. So those are the two main things I wanted to expound on. If there's more to it that you guys want to hear about, let me know. I really, for me reading this, a lot of this stuff just sounded familiar because I've studied this stuff before. So if there's something that was mentioned in this chapter that you really want to me to talk about more on, let me know. I'd be happy to do it. Otherwise, I'm gonna cut this video before it gets to be super, super long. And I will see you guys in the next video. Thanks for watching and take care.